March 15, 1944. Over the frozen fields of Bavaria, Captain James Howard throttled his P-51 Mustang through crystalline air at 28,000 feet, leading a formation of American bombers toward their target. The sky stretched endless and blue, the kind of perfect visibility that made pilots feel invincible. Howard and his fellow escort pilots believed this mission would be just another routine protection duty, shepherding the heavy bombers to their destination and back. They had no idea they were about to witness a tactical revolution that would fundamentally change aerial combat doctrine for the remainder of the conflict. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What unfolded that day would prove that superior technology combined with revolutionary thinking could transform a single pilot into a force multiplier capable of challenging overwhelming odds. The morning had begun unremarkably at the American Air Base in England. Howard, a former Navy pilot who had transferred to the Army Air Forces, conducted his pre-flight inspection with the methodical precision that had kept him alive through dozens of missions. His Mustang, nicknamed Ding Hao, bore the distinctive North American aviation design that had revolutionized long-range escort capability. The aircraft represented the culmination of American industrial innovation, a Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine producing 1,490 horsepower, driving the fighter to speeds exceeding 440 miles per hour at optimal altitude. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, Howard's wingman for the mission, performed his own checks on the adjacent flight line. Johnson was newer to combat operations, having completed only 12 missions compared to Howard's 37. The younger pilot had expressed concerns during the briefing about the distance they would be flying deep into contested airspace, but Howard had reassured him with characteristic confidence. The Mustang's range of 1,650 miles meant they could finally provide protection, all the way to targets that had previously been beyond escort capability. The mission called for escorting a formation of 53 B-17 flying fortresses, targeting aircraft manufacturing facilities near Augsburg. Intelligence reports suggested moderate resistance was expected, perhaps 24 interceptors at most. The bomber crews had been briefed on maintaining tight formation discipline, their interlocking fields of fire from hundreds of 50-caliber machine guns creating a defensive barrier that German pilots had learned to respect. Everything about the mission planning reflected standard doctrine developed over months of strategic bombing operations. But 300 miles into German airspace, the tactical situation began to deteriorate with alarming speed. Howard's radio crackled with urgent transmissions from other escort groups reporting mechanical failures, forcing them to turn back. Within 15 minutes, the carefully planned protection screen had collapsed. Howard found himself commanding the only remaining fighter group still with the bombers. Himself, Johnson, and one other Mustang, flown by Lieutenant William Beyer. 3 fighters to protect 53 heavy bombers penetrating deep into defended territory. Howard keyed his radio transmitter, his voice steady despite the gravity of their situation. "We're staying with the bombers," he announced to his tiny formation. "Maintain visual contact and conserve ammunition. We're going to be busy." From his position 5,000 feet above the bomber stream, Howard scanned the horizon with practiced intensity. The German response would come soon. Their radar networks had certainly tracked the American formation from the moment it crossed the coast. Fighter controllers on the ground would be directing interceptors toward the unescorted bombers, like wolves sensing wounded prey. The only question was when and where the attack would materialize. The answer came at 1400 hours. Howard spotted them first, a formation of approximately 40 German fighters climbing aggressively from the southeast. The distance specs resolved into Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190 series, their angular silhouettes unmistakable even at extreme range. The German formation flew in multiple layers, indicating experienced leadership and coordinated tactics. They were positioning themselves for textbook attack runs against the bombers' vulnerable positions. Howard's mind raced through calculations of speed, altitude, and geometry. Conventional doctrine called for escort fighters to remain close to the bombers, engaging attackers only when they committed to their attack runs. But conventional doctrine assumed numerical parity or superiority. With odds of more than 13-1 against them, conventional thinking would result in catastrophic bomber losses. Howard needed something different, something the Germans wouldn't expect. He remembered a technical briefing he had attended 2 months earlier at Wright Field in Ohio. An engineer named Robert Chilton had explained a peculiar characteristic of the Mustang's laminar flow wing design. The aircraft's elevator control cables ran through a specific routing that, when combined with aggressive use of the rudder and ailerons, could induce a deliberate instability in the control surfaces. Chilton had demonstrated how a pilot could intentionally create erratic flight patterns by manipulating the control cable's tension through rapid, coordinated inputs. The technique had no official designation, but pilots who had experimented with it called it the wire gambit. The principle was deceptively simple but extraordinarily difficult to execute. By rapidly alternating between hard rudder inputs and opposite aileron movements while simultaneously varying elevator pressure, a pilot could make the Mustang appear to be suffering from severe control problems. The aircraft would yaw and roll in unpredictable patterns that looked exactly like battle damage or mechanical failure. But the pilot retained complete control, able to instantly transition from apparent distress to aggressive maneuvering. The technique consumed enormous amounts of fuel and placed tremendous stress on the airframe, but it created a powerful psychological weapon: uncertainty. German pilots were trained to pursue damaged aircraft as easy victories. A fighter apparently struggling with control problems represented a low-risk target requiring minimal ammunition expenditure. But if that apparently crippled fighter suddenly revealed itself as fully functional and aggressively hostile, it created confusion and hesitation in the attacking formation. In aerial combat, hesitation measured in seconds could mean the difference between survival and defeat. Howard made his decision in the span of 3 heartbeats. "Break formation," he ordered Johnson and Bayer. "I'm going in alone. Maintain high cover on the bombers and engage any fighters that get through. Do not follow me down." Johnson's voice came back immediately, confusion evident despite radio distortion. "Captain, you can't engage 40 fighters alone. We should stay together." Howard's response was clipped and final. "That's an order, Lieutenant. Execute it now." He rolled the Mustang inverted and pulled the stick back, diving toward the German formation with throttle pushed to maximum. The Merlin engine's supercharger screamed as he accelerated through 450 miles per hour, the airframe shuddering from the speed. At 12,000 feet, still 2,000 feet above the German formation, Howard initiated the wire gambit. He slammed the rudder hard right, while simultaneously applying left aileron and forward elevator pressure. The Mustang's nose yawed violently to the right, even as the left wing dropped, creating a tumbling corkscrew motion that looked catastrophically out of control. Howard's body slammed against the harness straps as G-forces reversed and multiplied. His vision grayed at the edges from the violent maneuvers, but his hands maintained their precise inputs on the controls. He was orchestrating chaos while remaining in perfect command. From the German formation leader's perspective, the scene looked like an unexpected gift. Major Heinrich Wurzer, commanding the interceptor force from the cockpit of his Focke-Wulf 190A, watched the American fighter begin its death spiral. Wurzer had accumulated 47 confirmed victories over 3 years of combat. He recognized the signatures of structural failure when he saw them. The Mustang's controls had obviously been damaged, perhaps by fragments from an earlier encounter or mechanical malfunction. Wurzer keyed his radio. 8 and 9. Break off and finish that crippled fighter. The rest of the formation will proceed to the bombers. 2 German fighters peeled away from the main formation, their pilots eager for an easy addition to their victory tallies. They positioned themselves to attack from the Mustang's vulnerable 6 o'clock position, closing to within 800 meters before opening fire. Streams of 20mm cannon rounds and 13mm machine gun bullets reached toward Howard's aircraft. At precisely that moment, Howard executed the Gambit's second phase. He reversed all control inputs instantaneously. The apparently crippled Mustang suddenly snapped into a perfectly controlled barrel roll, simultaneously climbing and turning inside the pursuing German's turning radius. The transformation was so sudden and complete that the German pilot's muscle memory betrayed them. They had committed to firing solutions based on a helpless target. When that target became an aggressive predator in the span of 1 second, their own momentum carried them through Howard's firing envelope. Howard's 650 caliber machine guns erupted in a 2-second burst. The combined weight of fire, nearly 100 rounds per second, converged on the lead German fighter's engine cowling. The Focke-Wulf's BMW radial engine disintegrated under the hammering impacts. Coolant and oil sprayed across the windscreen as the propeller seized. The German pilot managed to roll inverted and drop away, streaming white vapor, as he descended toward an emergency landing. The second German fighter attempted to brake left, but Howard anticipated the maneuver. He applied hard right rudder while maintaining his bank angle, a skidding turn that kept his guns oriented toward the target even as his flight path curved away. Another short burst, this time walking across the Messerschmitt's wing route. The German fighter shuddered as rounds severed control cables. It entered an uncontrolled spin, the pilot struggling with a control column that no longer responded to his inputs. Major Wurzer watched 2 of his pilots fall away in less than 15 seconds. His tactical assessment shifted immediately. This was not a crippled fighter. This was either extraordinary luck or exceptional skill. Wurzer had survived too many combats to believe in luck. He barked new orders into his radio. All units be advised. That Mustang is fully operational and extremely dangerous. Proceed with caution. But Howard wasn't finished. He executed another wire Gambit sequence, this time adding a variation. He allowed the Mustang to enter what appeared to be a flat spin, the most feared aerial emergency. The aircraft rotated around its vertical axis while descending, nose high, controls apparently useless. It was the death spiral that haunted every pilot's nightmares. 4 more German fighters broke from the bomber attack to investigate what they assumed was a doomed aircraft. They circled cautiously, expecting to watch the American pilot bail out or ride the aircraft into the ground. Instead, at 6,000 feet, Howard snapped the Mustang out of the spin with textbook precision and climbed aggressively back into the German formation. The psychological impact was devastating. German pilots who moments before had been focused on attacking bombers now found themselves glancing nervously over their shoulders. That single American fighter had become an unpredictable threat that defied standard threat assessment protocols. It appeared damaged, then proved deadly. It seemed finished, then attacked again. The uncertainty metastasized through the formation's cohesion. Wurzer recognized the tactical deterioration immediately. His formation's discipline was fracturing as pilots focused on the individual threat rather than the primary mission. He made the decision that tactical doctrine demanded. All units, this is lead, disengage from the bombers, reform at altitude. We will eliminate this single fighter before proceeding to primary target. It was exactly what Howard wanted. Every second the German formation spent focused on him was a second the bombers flew unmolested toward their target. He had successfully transformed himself from escort fighter to decoy, from protector to target. But being the target meant absorbing the concentrated attention of nearly 40 enemy fighters with ammunition and fuel running low. Howard checked his fuel gauge. The wire Gambit's violent maneuvers consumed fuel at nearly 3 times the normal rate. He had perhaps 12 minutes of combat operations remaining before he would need to brake for home. His ammunition counters showed less than 30% remaining across all 6 guns. He needed to make every second and every round count. The German formation reorganized itself into a loose envelope surrounding Howard's position. Wurzer was coordinating a coordinated attack that would come from multiple directions simultaneously, overwhelming the Americans' ability to engage threats sequentially. It was the standard response to a single hostile aircraft: compress the engagement sphere until the target had nowhere to maneuver. Howard recognized the developing trap. In the bomber pilot's seat high above, Captain Richard Stone watched the aerial chess match unfold beneath his formation. Stone commanded one of the lead B-17s, and he had a clear view of the entire engagement. He had watched this single American fighter account for at least 3 German aircraft and tie up the entire enemy formation for nearly 8 minutes. His radio operator, Sergeant Michael Torres, sat at his station documenting the engagement in the aircraft's log. Stone turned to Torres, his voice carrying awe despite their own precarious situation. That pilot down there just saved our entire formation. Count how many German fighters are focused on him instead of us. Torres scanned the sky with binoculars, tallying the enemy aircraft. I count 37, sir. 37 fighters, and they're all trying to get that one Mustang. Stone shook his head slowly. I've been flying combat missions for 11 months. I've never seen anything like this. That's not fighting, that's art. Below, Howard prepared for what he knew would be the final phase of the engagement. His fuel state precluded extended combat. He needed one more demonstration of the wire Gambit's potential, one more psychological blow that would buy the bombers the maximum possible time. He selected his target, Major Wurza's Focke-Wulf, identifiable by its distinctive green spinner and command markings. Howard initiated what appeared to be a head-on attack run directly at Wurza's position. The two fighters closed at a combined speed exceeding 800 miles per hour, a collision course that promised mutual destruction. Standard doctrine called for both pilots to break off before merging, each seeking to turn inside the other's radius for a tail chase advantage. But Howard had no intention of following standard doctrine. At 1,000 meters separation, Howard triggered the wire Gambit's most extreme variation. He simultaneously applied full right rudder, full left aileron, maximum down elevator, and reduced throttle to idle. The Mustang snap-rolled inverted, while yawing hard right and pitching down. The combined maneuver looked like catastrophic structural failure, as though the aircraft had literally broken apart in mid-air. The Mustang tumbled through 3 dimensions in a pattern that seemed to violate basic physics. Wurza's combat instinct screamed at him to break away from what appeared to be an aircraft disintegrating directly in his flight path. He rolled hard left and dove, standard collision avoidance. But Howard's maneuver was completely controlled. At the moment of maximum apparent chaos, he reversed every input. The Mustang snapped back to controlled flight on a pursuit vector that put him directly behind Wurza's evading Focke-Wulf. Howard had perhaps 2 seconds before Wurza's experience would assert itself, and the German would execute countermeasures. He walked his rudder pedals left and right, skidding the Mustang's nose through a narrow arc that kept his gunsight Pipper tracking the evading target. His finger tightened on the trigger. The 650s roared for 1.7 seconds, expending the last of his ammunition. The convergence was perfect. Rounds stitched across the Focke-Wulf's fuselage from tail to cockpit. Wurza felt impacts hammer through his aircraft's structure. His canopy shattered as a .50 caliber round passed through the space his head had occupied a fraction of a second earlier. Another round severed his aileron control cables. The Focke-Wulf rolled violently to the left, completely unresponsive to Wurza's control inputs. The German major was many things, but he was not suicidal. With his aircraft crippled, and the American fighter having demonstrated capabilities that defied his 3 years of combat experience, Wurza made the only logical decision. He transmitted the general recall signal to his formation. All units, disengage, return to base, mission cancelled. Howard watched the German formation break apart, individual fighters scattering toward their home airfields. His fuel gauge showed he had perhaps 7 minutes of flying time remaining before he would be gliding. His ammunition was completely exhausted, but the bombers were clear. He had bought them the time they needed to reach their target and begin their attack runs. He climbed slowly back toward the bomber formation, his Mustang's engine running rough from the abuse it had endured. Lieutenant Johnson's voice came over the radio, crackling with emotion. "Captain, I count 11 German fighters breaking away, damaged or destroyed. You just fought off an entire formation by yourself." Howard's response was characteristically laconic. "Not by myself, Lieutenant. The bomber's gunners got several of them. I just kept the rest occupied." But Johnson had watched the entire engagement from his high-cover position. He had seen every maneuver, every impossible reversal, every moment when the captain's Mustang had appeared doomed, only to strike back like a coiled snake. The younger pilot knew he had witnessed something that would be discussed in ready rooms and tactical briefings for years to come. The return flight to England was tense. Howard's fuel situation was critical. He descended to 8,000 feet to reduce consumption, but the mathematics were unforgiving. With 70 miles still to go when his fuel gauge touched empty, Howard prepared for a water landing in the English Channel. But the Packard Merlin engine, built to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch by American industrial precision, continued to run on fuel vapors, and determination. The fighter's propeller was still turning when Howard's wheels touched down on the metal runway matting at his home base. The ground crews swarmed his aircraft the moment it rolled to a stop. The chief mechanic, Master Sergeant Frank Williams, climbed onto the wing to help Howard from the cockpit. Williams had maintained military aircraft for 19 years, and he had never seen an airframe that had endured what Ding Hao had absorbed that day. The wing roots showed stress wrinkles from the extreme G-loading. The control cables were stretched beyond normal tolerances. The engine cylinder head temperatures had exceeded redline parameters by significant margins. Williams shook his head in disbelief. "Captain, I don't know what you did up there, but this aircraft should be in pieces. The stress loads you put on the airframe would break most fighters apart." Howard accepted a cup of coffee from a waiting orderly, his hands steady despite the adrenaline ebbing from his system. "I did what the engineers designed it to do, Sergeant. North American built these birds to take punishment and keep flying. Your maintenance made the difference." But the real impact of Howard's engagement became clear over the following days. Intelligence officers debriefed every bomber crew that had participated in the mission. Their reports were consistent and remarkable. The German interceptor force had broken off its attack on the bomber formation after engaging a single American fighter. Estimated bomber losses that would have normally approached 15 to 20% were reduced to zero. Not a single B-17 was lost to German fighters that day. The tactical analysis teams at 8th Air Force Headquarters studied Howard's engagement with intense interest. His combat film, recovered from the gun camera mounted in his Mustang's nose, showed maneuvers that contradicted established fighter tactics doctrine. The film was sent to Wright Field for engineering analysis. Robert Chilton, the engineer who had first described the wire Gambit concept, watched the footage with growing amazement. Chilton compiled a detailed technical report on Howard's engagement. He calculated that the wire Gambit maneuvers had subjected the airframe to instantaneous G-loads exceeding 8.7, well above the standard design parameters. The control surface deflections had exceeded normal ranges by 30 to 40%. By every conventional engineering metric, the aircraft should have experienced structural failure. But North American aviation's design margins, driven by American manufacturing's tendency toward over-engineering, had provided the strength necessary to survive maneuvers no designer had anticipated. The report concluded with a recommendation that the wire Gambit be studied for potential inclusion in advanced fighter tactics training. But it also noted a crucial limitation. The technique required extraordinary physical conditioning, exceptional spatial awareness, and intimate knowledge of the aircraft's handling characteristics at the edges of the flight envelope. It was not a tactic that could be taught to average pilots. It required natural ability, combined with extensive experience. Word of Howard's engagement spread through the fighter community with remarkable speed. Pilots requested transfers to Mustang squadrons specifically to learn the techniques Howard had demonstrated. But Howard himself was reluctant to teach the wire Gambit as a standard tactic. He understood that what had worked for him resulted from a unique combination of circumstances: his prior Navy carrier experience, his exceptional physical conditioning, and perhaps most importantly, his willingness to accept risks that would paralyze most pilots with fear. In a letter to his wife, Howard reflected on the engagement with characteristic humility. "I did what needed to be done," he wrote. "The boys in the bombers were counting on us. If I had stayed with standard tactics, we would have lost aircraft and crews. Sometimes you have to trust your instincts and your training, even when they tell you to do something that looks crazy to everyone else." The official recognition came 3 weeks later. Captain James Howard was awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions on March 15, 1944. The citation specifically noted his voluntary engagement of overwhelming enemy forces and his success in protecting the bomber formation through exceptional airmanship and tactical innovation. He became the only fighter pilot in the European theater to receive the Medal of Honor for a single mission. But the wire Gambit's real legacy extended far beyond individual recognition. Tactical doctrine officers incorporated elements of Howard's techniques into advanced fighter training curricula. The concept of using apparent vulnerability as a psychological weapon became a recognized tactic in air combat theory. Fighter pilots learned that superior technology combined with innovative thinking could multiply combat effectiveness far beyond raw numbers. The psychological impact on German fighter forces was equally significant. Intelligence intercepts revealed that German tactical briefings began emphasizing caution when engaging apparently damaged American fighters. Pilots who had witnessed Howard's engagement transmitted detailed warnings about American tactical innovations. The certainty that had characterized German fighter doctrine eroded, replaced by wariness that reduced aggressive pursuit of damaged aircraft. That hesitation, multiplied across hundreds of engagements, saved American lives. Major Heinrich Würzer survived his damaged aircraft's return to base. He spent 2 weeks recovering from minor injuries before returning to combat operations. In post-engagement reports, he described the American pilot's tactics as demonstrating a level of skill and innovation that required fundamental reassessment of American fighter capabilities. Würzer's professional respect for his opponent was evident in every sentence of his analysis. The bomber crews who had witnessed Howard's engagement carried their own memories forward. Captain Richard Stone wrote a detailed account of what he had observed for the squadron history. "That single fighter pilot saved our entire formation," Stone wrote. "We counted 37 enemy fighters focused on him instead of us. He bought us the time we needed with his own aircraft as the only coin he had to spend. I don't know if he understood what he was doing, or if he just reacted on instinct, but the result was the same. We all came home because he was willing to stand alone against impossible odds." Sergeant Michael Torres kept his log entry from that mission for the rest of his life. Years later, he would show it to his grandchildren, pointing to the simple sentences that captured an extraordinary moment. 1,400 hours. Single Mustang engaged entire German fighter formation. 14:15. Enemy formation breaking up in confusion. 14:30. Enemy fighters withdrawing. Bomber formation proceeding to target unmolested. Torres would tell them that sometimes the most important moments in history could be reduced to a few lines in a logbook, but those lines represented lives saved and futures preserved. The technical lessons from Howard's engagement influenced fighter development for the remainder of the conflict and beyond. Engineers at North American Aviation incorporated the insights from his combat stress testing into subsequent aircraft designs. The P-51D model, introduced later in 1944, featured reinforced wing spars and enhanced control cable routing that explicitly accounted for extreme maneuvering loads. The wire gambit, while never officially designated as standard doctrine, had pushed aircraft design in directions that improved combat survivability for all pilots. In the decades after the conflict ended, aviation historians analyzed Howard's engagement as a case study in tactical innovation under pressure. The engagement demonstrated several principles that transcended specific technologies or historical contexts. First, that superior numbers could be negated by superior thinking and execution. Second, that psychological factors in combat were as important as physical capabilities. Third, that established doctrine should inform but not constrain tactical decision-making when circumstances demanded innovation. Howard himself rarely spoke about the engagement in public. He returned to civilian life after the conflict, becoming a flight instructor and eventually working in agricultural aviation. When asked about his Medal of Honor mission, he consistently deflected attention to the bomber crews he had protected and the ground crews who had maintained his aircraft. The warrior's humility was as much a part of his character as the courage that had driven him into combat against overwhelming odds. But in private conversations with fellow pilots, Howard would occasionally discuss the technical aspects of the wire gambit. He emphasized that the technique was not reckless, but calculated. Every maneuver had been practiced extensively during his training flights. Every control input had been refined through countless hours of experimentation with the Mustang's flight characteristics. What appeared to outside observers as improvised chaos was actually the execution of carefully developed procedures under extreme stress. The Mustang itself, tail number 437274, was eventually retired from combat operations and returned to the United States for engineering analysis. It was displayed at Wright Field for several years as a training aid, its airframe bearing the scars of that March afternoon over Bavaria. Eventually, it was scrapped as part of the massive drawdown of military assets after the conflict's conclusion. but photographs and technical drawings preserved the details of its construction, ensuring that the lessons learned from its extreme service would inform future generations of aircraft designers. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, who had watched Howard's engagement from above, went on to complete 63 combat missions. He survived the conflict and eventually became a commercial airline pilot. In interviews late in his life, Johnson would describe watching Captain Howard's impossible aerial ballet as the moment he truly understood what exceptional airmanship looked like. "It changed how I thought about flying," Johnson said. "I realized that the aircraft's capabilities were limited more by the pilot's imagination and courage than by the engineering specifications. Captain Howard showed us all what was possible when you combined perfect control with fearless execution." The 53 bomber crews who reached their target that day because one fighter pilot stood between them, and annihilation carried their gratitude forward for the rest of their lives. Many of them never knew the name of the pilot who had saved them. They simply knew that when they needed protection most desperately, when the tactical situation had deteriorated to the point where losses seemed inevitable, someone had stepped forward to accept impossible odds on their behalf. In the final analysis, the wire gambit represented something larger than a tactical innovation or an individual act of heroism. It demonstrated the human capacity to transcend apparent limitations through courage, skill, and innovative thinking. The German formation that attacked the bombers that day possessed overwhelming numerical superiority, equivalent aircraft performance, and tactical advantage. By every rational calculation, they should have devastated the bomber formation and eliminated the escort fighter within minutes. But rational calculations cannot fully account for human factors. They cannot measure the impact of one individual's willingness to accept risk on behalf of others. They cannot quantify the psychological effect of facing an opponent who refuses to accept defeat even when defeat appears inevitable. They cannot predict how innovation under pressure can transform tactical situations in ways that doctrine and planning cannot anticipate. Captain James Howard's engagement over Bavaria on March 15, 1944, stands as a testament to these immeasurable factors. A single pilot in a single aircraft, armed with superior technology and extraordinary skill, held off a force that outnumbered him more than 13 to 1. He did not win through superior firepower or numerical advantage. He won through superior thinking, innovative application of his aircraft's capabilities, and the courage to execute maneuvers that most pilots would reject as suicidal. The wire gambit itself faded from common usage after the conflict. Modern aircraft with computer-assisted flight controls and different tactical environments made the specific techniques Howard employed less relevant. But the principle behind the gambit, that apparent weakness could be transformed into tactical advantage through innovative thinking, remained central to air combat doctrine. Fighter pilots in subsequent conflicts learned to question assumptions, to recognize that superior forces could be defeated through superior strategy, and that the human element in combat could overcome material disadvantages. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.